Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of UPrera Talks. My name is Anka Anton. I'm the UPrera Director of Public Relations and Administration, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this to UPrera Talks, to today's edition. As you know, UPrera is the European Public Relations Education and Research Association. We are an association present in over 50 countries, and we have a bit more than 550 members, conducting all kinds of exciting activities and research. And today we are happy to present you one of these projects through the UPrera Talks. Today we are going to talk about the European Communication Monitor, which is basically a staple of European research in communication, in strategic communication, public relations. Over the last 15 years, the team has been conducting top-tier research on several topics. This year, we are going to look into some of the insights of the 15th edition of the 2023 edition. And basically, for the next about an hour, we're going to go through these insights, and through some of the discussion, hopefully you'll raise some questions. Now, as I said, the UPrera Talks is a series of webinars, and we invite you to go over some of the webinars that we've organized until now. You can find them all on the UPrera YouTube channel. When you have the time, please go through them. They cover a wide array of topics, and I'm sure that you'll find some that are interesting. And if you're not part of UPrera, please join. It is a lovely place to interact and a lovely community. So now it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, which is Ralph Tench, and he will guide us through today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Anka. And hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to talk today about the European Communication Monitor, which Anka says has been running for 15 years. And we're going to talk about some key insights. In 2023, what we've done is we've done a reflection on the project and looked at what have been the key learnings that we've taken away from that over the 15-year period, but also looking back a little bit on or thinking forward as to what the implications are for practice from what we've learned. We've got some slides to come, I think are going to join us in a second, which I'll begin to talk through. So here we go. So essentially, I'm going to be talking along with my colleague, Dejan Verčič. Both Dejan and I have been involved in the project. Dejan from the very outset in the first year in 2007. I joined in 2008. The discussion today is then going to be including our colleague Stephen Waddington, who is a practitioner and a author, blogger, influencer, but also a former president of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations in the UK. So the structure is really going to be Dan and I talking through some of these themes, these issues, and some of our thoughts for the future. And then we'll have a discussion with Stephen and a conversation from Stephen's perspective as someone who crosses that divide between academia and practice. Just to jump back on the background to the project. Many of you may know about it, but I'll just give a very brief sort of context. We've been running this every year for 15 years since 2007. And to be honest, it's quite some feat in reality, because for an academic study, this is quite unheard of. It's not been repeated in our field. And it's currently the longest standing and the largest study of the professional communications community worldwide. And from the outset, as Anka's indicated, we're connected to the UPrera initiative, but this has been supported by UPrera from the very outset, and we're very grateful for that as well. In 2017, we actually did an exercise of sort of stopping and thinking as well, which is in those books that are identified on the right-hand side there, where we produced something called the Comparative Excellence Framework. So we looked back over what we'd studied over those 10 years and tried to look at what does high performance look like in organizations, both at the individual, the departmental, and also at the organizational level. And that came through in that treaty that we put together in that book, as well as in a number of other academic papers that came out with it. As you can see, that book subsequently been translated 2 or 3 times now. And in 2023, what we decided after 15 years, it was probably time to sort of stop and think again. A lot had happened in the communications industries in that intervening period. And we thought it best to sort of let's have a think about what's happened. As I've said, we've been studying this with the support and the inclusion of many, many practitioners, up to 40,000 from 50 countries. So it's a significant number of people we've spoken to. In Europe, as some of you may also know, we have then also had parallel and complementary studies done in North America and Latin America and the Asia Pacific regions as well, using the same and same methodology and then similar questionnaire structures, just with some nuanced changes in those areas. A very quick shout out at the bottom here. I just want to mention the team. As I've mentioned, there's been a core of us for the last 15 years working on this together. So Dejan and Ansgar Zerfas at Leipzig has been our leader throughout all that time, along with Angeles Moreno and Pete Verhoeven, who was with us up until about 3-4 years ago. And Pete took a step back from the project, and Alex Booman from BI in Norway joined us. I do also want to give recognition to our colleagues from across the European UPRERA community, who've been very important as collaborators in helping us to disseminate and engage with practice in their region. So that's why we name our collaborators on that international network as well. Final shout out has to go to our sponsors. We have been supported by UPRERA, but also the European Association of Communication Directors, and our sort of more formal financial support has come from Sission, as well as partners Seacom, Nora, and Fink and Fuchs as well. So what I'm going to do first is just talk a little, very quickly, about looking back over the most important strategic issues that we've had from the study in the last 15 years. Excuse, that looks to me like the PowerPoint's jumped about a bit on this, so apologies for that as it's come onto this screen. We're going to reflect back, but talk about some of those strategic issues for communication management from 2007 to 2023. And we've got 5 really that we've identified and talked about that we can consistently see and think are important. So the first one is this concept of trust, which is an ever-present in the kind of feedback that we've had from managers in Europe since 2007, and it peaked with its most relevance in 2018. The next one that we've identified again is linking business strategy and communication, which for the first 10 years I think was #1 in our kind of themes that came out. It then had a slight dip in about 2019 as we saw operational issues, possibly technological change, things like big data began to come through as some of the rising themes, but we're now seeing it coming back to being an important area for our colleagues. The third one that is, again, perhaps not a massive surprise, that dealing with sustainability and social responsibility was always one of our top themes, and it did have again a similar dip around that same period, but interestingly back on the rise. Probably no surprise at all, bearing in mind the worldwide landscape we're dealing with in terms of what organizations are facing with environment, climate, all those various things. The fifth one, and these are the issues that have probably been a bit more recent that have come through, are dealing with the speed and volume of information. And our media landscapes have transformed, and we're basically living in a much more digitalized world. So we're seeing that has become, since 2014, has become one of our bigger trending themes. And the final one to touch on is then big data and algorithms. Without claiming any great prescience, the community that we were talking to back in 2016 had already, 6 years before ChatGPT, we were talking about this as a rising issue for them. And so I think, we've seen that since then keep a very high position in our discussions. What we're going to do now, though, so that's a kind of reflection, and this is all contained, by the way. We produced this report for 2023. We've produced a book like this every single year with data in it. This one was a reflective document more about what we've gathered. You can access this and download this as a PDF from our website, www.communicationmonitor.eu. Along with all of the past reports. We've got videos on there and other summary documents that you can access as well. So they're all open access and free to use if you haven't seen them before. But what we're going to do now, that was kind of a reflection on some of the big themes and issues that we've identified. What Dejan and I are going to do now is, between us, we're just going to talk through. What we've then done is think about these, the picture that we've created, the understanding that we've got over this period of time, to think about what happens next, what's the future. So we've again come up with 5 thematic areas, which Dan will talk through briefly, and then we'll go through each one with what we're calling theses or hypotheses for practice and research and education, things that will have resonance and importance going forward. So I'll hand over to Dan because this will be the next section we'll talk on, and we'll go through them individually.
So one of the most important things that we've been doing in European Communication Monitor was trying to understand what are the trends happening in Europe at the moment and where we should all look at and what should we be preparing for. And if we look at what is currently happening around us, there are 5 themes which are quite obvious that practitioners in public relations, communication management, strategic communication, that field should prepare for are, first of all, the technology. Technology is really changing the game, and it's substantially changing not only communication, it's changing also economy and society, and we should be at the top of this trend. Second thing is, because of these fundamental changes which are happening around us, competencies for good practitioners are changing. We are getting more and more important positions. We are going higher in the decision-making hierarchy. And for that reason, practitioners should understand what new roles are there emerging and what should we be preparing and training ourselves for. The third thing is that our audiences are changing. We are talking about living in a hyper-connected world where distinctions between inside and outside organization are changing, where spatial differences across the globe are practically disappearing. And we should be able to be much faster and understand how these different audiences communicate directly between themselves, that where do we fit in and how are we going to reach these audiences and how can we build a multi-logs actually with them. The next thing, which is very important, is that we should be able as practitioners to develop competencies for leading and motivating our teams. This is not a solitary game anymore. Still, in many organizations, you can find one PR practitioners doing it all, but more and more we are seeing large operations emerging involving dozens, even hundreds of practitioners working together, and actually managing ourselves is becoming an issue in itself. And finally, relationships are extremely important. I'm always saying where you have high tech, you should also consider high touch. And how are we going to manage this relationship between ourselves, within organizations, across organizations, between organizations, any society as a whole, at the time when we are dealing with completely new ways in which misinformation and distrust are appearing around us, is a new challenge to which we should be preparing ourselves, and it's going to be a very funny game. So, when we are talking about technology, what is really happening here is that we are witnessing a change of everything we knew before. I'm always saying the change the digital technology is bringing to us is the same as it was the printing press bringing changes in the 15th and 16th century in the Western Europe. Actually, all structures are going down, and we have to figure out how we are going to understand these new changes, how we are going to be on the top of this technology. As we all know, people who went to public relations were known to be not very good with numbers. They were people person, writing very well, but always had problems with numbers. This has to change. We have to become tech people as well. This is the other phase that we have to develop and develop very fast. Second thing which is here important is to understand that the way digital technology operates is that it's tearing down all kinds of barriers, internally and externally. And we have to understand that our competencies to cooperating also with other teams within organizations are changing, and we have to be more able and faster able to move around and be able to cooperate all across organizations and be the connecting part of organizations, so to say. So this is extremely important, and we have to be, again, at the top of the wave of introduction of digital technologies in our organizations, because these are not technical problems. These are social problems, and these are the problems that we should be able to lead. And the final thing is cybersecurity. Particularly in larger countries and the larger companies, they have already faced serious attacks. Cybersecurity is going to be an extremely and more important issue to consider, and we should understand what it means for us, for our organizations. A lot of cyber breach is also going to affect the even financial performance of our organizations. So unless we understand it, unless we are able to raise awareness across organizations about the changes that this brings to our lives, we will have problems. But we don't want to have problems, so we have to be in front of all these changes, and that's why we have to digitalize first ourselves.
Thanks, Dejan. So I mentioned earlier this kind of book the treatise we did back in 2017. In that, as I've mentioned, we talked about the skills of the individual, or what we want for a high performing individual. And we've thought about this again in this latest reflection on what we've learned. In that comparative excellence framework, the knowledge and the skills and what we call the competencies for high performance are identified. But why is it important? Well, I think that the reason that we've identified for us is that strategic communication in this world that Dejan's just described, global, mediatized, data-driven, it's not that easy. And maybe we haven't always kept pace with the changes that we need to have as communicators to be able to operate at the right level. And as I've said, this role, our communicator's role, is changing, and there's a greater move towards engagement across, as just described, multimedia platforms. We're using, as described, much greater management of these big data sets, skills that we didn't previously perhaps have to deal with when we were involved in much more media relations, one-to-one, one-to-small group communication. And we've also got the inevitable rise of generative AI, which we all know is having a potentially transformational effect on not only communication, but work itself. And I think these changes are going to inevitably create what we're going to see as, and we're already identified as, competency gaps, which need to be addressed to enable practitioners to keep up. So in essence, what we've then come up with is some of these thoughts about what we will have to do. So we've consistently noted that communication practitioners lack some of these core competencies to meet the challenges. And I do think that means that we're often not maximizing in the organization the contribution that the communicator could have, certainly in some of the technical and the practical skills, as well as in the strategic skills. So I think one of the things that we're calling out here in this first thesis is to be more effective in evaluating ourselves, being critical about our strengths and our weaknesses, to benchmark and audit our own skill sets and our knowledge base, as well as then providing the provision of or enabling an uptake of more training to meet these different demands, identifying them and then going for training. The second thesis on here is that we need to see that we have new opportunities that we've identified for communicators and organizations to behave not just as technicians, but more importantly in the future as advisors and consultants. And we're seeing this as a role that is coming through in a number of organizations, and that's consulting not just in an agency sense, but being an internal consultant within the organization. And we're identifying these as two really important roles that we see could and will be expected to grow in the future. And we need to think about how to prepare for that. And the third proposal on there is for increased, essentially, encapsulating all of this, is to increase the amount of training that we do, not only for those of us who are entering into a profession, so early career, but also for the seasoned communicator, so that we don't fall out of step with what's necessary and what's required, and to ensure the departments are up to speed on the cutting edge of what not only the organisation needs, but also where society is going, as we've touched upon. Muted, Dejan.
I've already mentioned that we are living in a changing world where technology is changing the very rules of the game. And what we are seeing today is convergence of different media into the same mix, in which we have to be able to walk from into very wide areas, from face-to-face to communication which is happening in virtual media with augmented reality. Ralph mentioned generative AI. So we have to figure out how we are working in an environment in which you cannot count only on certain media that you prepared for. The predominance of traditional mass media is over, and we have to be able to understand this convergence, and where in this convergence we are operating. Everybody is talking about omni-media communication, and this is definitely a reality in which we live. Second thing is hybridization of various disciplines that were operating in our field. Historically, there used to be this big division with editorial part of media and journalistic part of the advertising part of media, between editorial and advertising. All this is breaking down. What we are seeing today is emergence of native journalism, of direct marketing, and similar disciplines, which are really happening in as we speak, so to say, and changing the rules of the game. And nobody quite understands how to behave in that environment, because the rules we have to abide were written for the previous century. And even if we look at solutions that are often offered in front of us, they are how could we go back and reach to some kind of balance that existed in the middle of the 20th century. Unfortunately or fortunately, that time has gone and it's not coming back. We have to be able to understand how do we operate in this hybrid environment where we are changing hats, so to say, on a daily basis. And the third thing, for which we are quite badly prepared, I would say, in public relations compared, for example, to our colleagues in advertising, is the visual turn. We were all trained in books, and we were trained for writing, and we have a huge problem of understanding how to communicate in pictures and movies, and moving pictures, which is the reality of today's environment. Our kids are growing in a much faster, also from the communication point of view, much faster world. They are not prepared to listen for a whole hour like we are now going to talk. They want things to happen much faster. 2 minutes is already a long time, and you can communicate richer using more visuals, being prepared to making good videos and things like that, for which we are not in public relations necessarily very well prepared. And we have to understand and we have to figure out how, again, we are going to get on the top of that visual turn, which is happening not only in the profession, it's happening in the society as a whole.
The fourth area I'm going to talk about then is how we work with the types of teams that we're engaged with in this kind of different world that we now work in. I'll talk about how basically, if we look at organizations, there's many of them have developed what we call new models of operating or teamwork and how they lead those teams. And there's a greater focus on inclusivity, participation, often to meet social changes, but also this hyper-connected world. Many of the teams we work on, like today, we're able to do this kind of engagement over a medium. And we have many of us who will be on calls after this that are in teams that are virtual again. So we work in a different way. And how do we motivate and lead those teams is a challenge. In 2022, we specifically focused on looking at leadership in organizations and by communicators. And we focused and found evidence of what's called empathic leadership, which is a style of leadership that became popular as we identified it through that COVID-19 pandemic period, because it was focused much more for those of you who were in work or were in teams even at university, where we had a greater appreciation for the well-being of the individual, the citizen, the employee in our communities. And empathy essentially means me standing in someone else's shoes if I'm the leader, and taking another person's viewpoint, trying to see their worldview. And empathetic leaders try to truly understand how somebody else thinks, but also how they emotionally feel about an issue. And we actually in 2022 found that 7 out of 10 of our respondents, so these are senior practitioners in Europe, reported that their leaders were showing these empathic traits. And from this, we discovered that there were 3 ways that leaders show empathy, which are by caring about the personal well-being of other people. In other words, showing some sensitivity and understanding for context. Also identifying more clearly individual strengths, but also their limitations. And thirdly, paying attention with what's talked about quite a lot in communications now, which is having good listening skills. The second thesis here is we all know that stress can have both positive and negative impacts on us, make us perform better, but sometimes make us perform worse. And we looked in 2018 around the main drivers of work stress for the communicator. And quite interesting here that we found 4 factors. The first one, which our modern world is not helping with, is this idea of being constantly available outside work time. So that's the focus on the phone calls, emails, other forms of engagement and contact. The second area that was causing that stress was overall workload. In other words, just too much, which is a very common issue in many walks of life, but particularly in communication and particular roles in communication. The other stressful element was the potentially limited opportunity in the organization to either grow or advance, progress, cause stress. And the final one was about work getting in the way of life and interfering in essentially in personal time. And we've seen that last aspect grow probably even more since we did this data collection in 2018, particularly because of COVID and other things. But we found an increasing change, and the work-life boundaries have changed. They're more permeable today than they ever were. Hybrid working has changed how we operate, but linked to that, then many more people are actually looking for that work-life balance. They're actually asking questions, and there are conversations that were not there 10 years ago around a full-time person maybe only being in an organizational setting or available for work for 4 days a week. This is a realistic conversation. And the third case that I want to then talk about is this point of diversity. And there's clearly a frequent conversation societally, organizationally, around the need for more diversity in organizations. The benefits are measurable, and they're frequently cited in terms of increased creativity and greater inclusive thinking. It strengthens what we call often a requirement for the organisation to have its license to operate without these initiatives. But it's more important than that, because it can actually provide advantage to the organisation, even competitive advantage, if they have a greater appreciation of the societal makeup. But concepts like EDI have been introduced, but I think they are lacking in communications. And we are finding that in communications we've failed often. We've seen some work, some endeavours around issues around gender and race, but still not particularly successful. And we must, as an industry, I think, work harder to embrace and actively endorse equality, diversity, inclusion, but at all its levels, in all of its elements. So the work we've done to date is good, but we need to do more. But there's also questions that we need to address around social and economic backgrounds as barriers to entry, not only other more formal, traditional, understood areas of EDI. And we in education, I suppose, have a significant role to play, and as do employers. I'm going to pass on now to Dejan, who's going to talk about misinformation and distrust.
Yes, the final thing that we have to deal with is that these social platforms, the digital world in which we live today, has opened a range of questions of misinformation, and we are talking about the post-truth society even today. And we have to find out, how do we develop relationships in that new digital environment. And as public relations practitioners, we should empower ourselves also how to use digital tools to manage the questions of truth and misinformation in the digital environment. Second, in these new circumstances, questions of authenticity, emotional engagement, and storytelling are becoming more and more important. And we should be able to understand how we can build on them, how can we preserve our own authenticity in this environment which are all the time we creating. How do we keep the emotions alive in that environment, and actually how we can use stories to tell what we have to tell, and how we can engage people into understanding what we are trying to convey to them. And the final thing is that all these changes are also raising questions of the ethics. While we had in previous times different disciplines very well differentiating among themselves, namely public relations, journalism, and advertising, and each of them could use their own logic, their own ethical codes, and so on and so forth. Now we are in a new environment where we need new types of applied ethics, and we have to develop new ethical guidelines that are going to keep us socially acceptable, even so to say, to the society as a whole, and make our profession as ethical as possible, and actually doing good not only to our clients but also to the society as a whole.
So thanks, Dejan. Right, what we're going to do now is invite Stephen to give his reflections on what we've discussed. But I'll re-emphasize, please feel free to drop questions into the system so that we can respond. If you have any thoughts, any challenges, any observations from what we've said, anything that we haven't clarified, please feel free to drop that into the chat, and we'll try to respond. But Stephen, over to you. How does this play out for you? Is it nonsense? Are we talking sense?
No.
I'm genuinely interested to know. I mean, you're a critical observer of both academia, but also practice as a practitioner. So, how does it land for you?
So thanks, Ralph, and thanks for the invitation to join you today and reflect on this conversation. So I firmly come from the perspective of being pragmatic about the role of public relations in society as a driver of the economy, enabling organizations to build better relationships with stakeholders in all their different forms. And as you know, I've had a journey of 25 years as a practitioner, working in a variety of different roles, latterly in management, and most recently formally taken up a role within academia as a PhD student, taking this perspective, this management perspective of the value of public relations and its contribution to organizations. So that picks up on, you know, much of the work that was done around excellence within management in the 80s and 90s, and in public relations itself by people like James Grunig and the team there. And then I guess, you know, the work that you've picked up as a team over the past 15 years with the European Communication Monitor. I'm particularly influenced by the excellence framework that you've developed, because the comparative excellence framework, because I think, you know, that explains very clearly the role and contribution of public relations at an organizational level, at a functional level within a team. And then, sorry, that's the fire alarm going off. We'll have to work through that. Sorry about that. That's right. Friday morning fire alarm. Yes, sorry, the comparative excellence framework and the way that sets out the role of public relations operating at an organizational level, at a team level, and then the contribution of individuals. I think that's particularly useful. So I got some comments on each of the 5 areas that you pulled out and the theses that you've drawn upon. I just want to reflect on those and throw these into the conversation, if you like. So the first one was data and tech. You know, the explosion in data is a huge opportunity for public relations. You know, created initially by the internet, data in lots of different forms, and you know, it's led to a huge third-party market in tools within our discipline. You've rightly pointed out we need to get better at being able to use those tools. CIPR did a study this year that identified 100,000 different tools in public relations for every aspect of workflow, and I think that's you know something we really need to get to grips with. If we don't, other disciplines will. I think related to that, we missed the social. We didn't foresee. I mean, you cannot foresee and create regulation ahead of something like social media or AI. But, you know, we're operating now and we can see the impact already of AI on organizations. And it's interesting to see, we're starting to see challenges in law at the interface between organizations and publics as it relates to AI, but then also legislation through, you know, the executive order that was published last week by the US president, and also in the European Union, the AI Act. You know, we need to get across those and understand the perspective of those for our organizations. So first one, data and tech. The second one, competence. This is a real area for me, really interesting area for me as it pertains to my own study. I mean, you know, we're already seeing the role of AI push at both the functional role of public relations in terms of, you know, some of the entry level activities that a practitioner would do in terms of content creation and listening. But I think we haven't seen the impact on senior roles and the potential in senior roles that's almost certain to come in terms of being able to make sense of large data sets and understand those, both from a planning point of view, but also a measurement perspective. And I think, you know, there's both huge opportunity and threat there. PR falls between an occupation and a profession, and that's great for diversity, or it should be great for diversity of recruitment. But it means that we don't necessarily hold ourselves to the management standards, to the standards that management would necessarily want in other professional roles. And I think that's the biggest challenge. And it varies hugely, I appreciate, from market to market. But, you know, I'm sat in the UK, somewhere like the UK, you know, 100,000 practitioners, a third have a professional qualification, a fraction sign up to what you'd recognize in management as fundamental requirements in terms of the development of competency, such as continuous professional development. And so there's much more needs to be done there. At the same time, though, we're seeing, I'll come on to this, we're seeing bigger and bigger opportunity to take an active role in management. Your third point, reach and impact. So feature of communication, public relations since the internet. Dejan talked about the explosion in different types of media. Now, functionally, a practitioner is expected to work across paid, earned, shared, and owned different types of media. That in itself creates huge opportunity for us. It's led to an explosion in roles, but also in complexity. It's interesting, Dejan picks out visual media as an issue because, yes, I believe in other creative professions such as advertising, as he cites, there's an ability to think much better in terms of visual and moving image, and that's a challenge for us. We've always been focusing on words. There's also the challenge of working with algorithmic media, so being able to understand and manage algorithms. Talked about the motivation of teams. There is a huge assertive opportunity within management right now, and there has been since COVID, related to the complexity in the world, geopolitics, AI. The relationship and perspective of organizations, I think, is more important than ever. And against that backdrop, we are finally, as a profession, getting our head around the fact that our team should represent the diversity of the publics with which we engage. There's so many circular arguments that we seem to go through within practice, but the diversity one has been one that's been around since the 70s and 80s, feminized profession, but yet the majority of our leadership is male. Also relates to D&I, socioeconomic factors, and so forth, and we really do need to level up there. The mental health issue as well. We've got fluid boundaries between work and life, and increasingly expected to operate in that sphere. It's also creating a divide across the age. Younger people are expected to be able to work more fluidly. Maybe more traditional older managers are expecting to people to be in the office. So that's creating an area of complexity. And then finally, I think the point. I think we've finally woken up in the profession to the issue of mental health. It was always a factor in emergency response and crisis, but the very nature of us operating in a 24/7 environment as practitioners, I think there's a much more awareness within the management of teams for the need for, to build resilience and mental capacity. And your final point about the relationship perspective, and I think this is, the really important factor for me, where I think I started, where public relations has huge value. We live in a hyper-connected world. 2 billion people will go to the polls next year. There's huge threats to democracy from different forms of fake media, disinformation, and AI, and so forth. And I think the face-to-face relationship perspective is more important than ever. Ironically, that's something that AI will never, ever be able to replace. So, I think we've got a huge assertive future of opportunity, and we just need to push forward and lean into it. Hope that's useful, and I hope we can now take a relationship perspective with some of our viewers and have maybe a wider dialogue.
Thank you, Stephen. Is there anything, just I suppose, as we've talked and you've seen our work over the years, is there anything in there that either surprises you or you perhaps find you don't necessarily concur with? We talk about things, we try to gather data, it's coming from a whole range of areas, but is there anything in the things that crop up in these conversations? I mean, you've obviously, I can see you've resonated with a number of those theses, and you can articulate them and see them. But are there any that surprise you, or think that are blind spots, or something that the industry is not necessarily addressing?
I think we have this existential crisis within practice about needing to be respected by management. And I think it's apparent. It's apparent where our shortfalls are, and it just astonishes me that we just do not seem to learn about the need to develop management domain knowledge within public relations, first of all, and then secondly, management competency to be able to operate at a management level. I think that's the industry's education and professional development, I think, is the industry's biggest challenge. For this work itself, I think it's a practitioner perspective. I think, it would be, and I know this is how you're thinking as a team, it'd be really interesting to take this work into management and challenge management as to, the practitioner perspective.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that we've talked about a lot. I mean, one of the strengths and one of the weaknesses of our methodology is it's inclusive of many countries. It takes in a large number of quite senior practitioners. But its weaknesses, we're asking practitioners to tell us about their own work rather than someone else methodologically looking in. Yes, that's a fair point. One of the things that we've identified in the work over the years, we've done this when we did the comparative excellence piece, was to try to look at organizations and communication from the individual, the department, and then obviously at the macro organizational level. And what we've identified from that is that, unfortunately, a minority of communicators are operating at that higher level of high performance, if that makes sense. Does that surprise you? Does that resonate with you in terms of your experiences, or would you say that we've undersold the quality of the practice across Europe? And this is based on data, self-completed data. This is how people identify their own work according to that model. But does that surprise you?
No, I think no, because I think so much of the perspective, particularly in an agency environment within practice in Europe, is focused on media, and media is the primary channel. The being part of the news cycle. So no, I don't think that's surprising at all. I do think that, and there was a moment of awakening for me within practice during COVID, when suddenly within every organization, public relations got elevated to the management team if it wasn't there before. And that ranged from the public health response within our health services right the way through to every organization that had to move to some sort of remote configuration or saw it changes to its supply chain. It pulled in expertise from the public relations practice. That quickly reverted, or has reverted, unfortunately. But I think there's still a really important legacy from that, where we had a moment where we saw the potential, and I know that's led almost to an awakening and a desire to achieve that higher level ambition.
When we have questions from our viewers, so I suggest that.
Can we see them? I can't see them on my screen.
Okay, Ralph, I'm going to read you then the one I'm delegating to you. So there is a question from SK saying, which are more precisely the new competencies communication practitioners have to develop? How to assess and certify that?
Yeah, I mean, these are interesting. I think we don't necessarily have that provision. I mean, that's probably one of the challenges, and there's possibly an open space there. We obviously have through universities, we are training in a certain level at degree courses and master's courses. We train and develop students with the critical thinking about the discipline. The questions that we're raising, though, is what happens with, as Stephen's called it, and it's the term of continuing professional development is well known in organizations and in human resources as to how to keep practitioners at the top of their professional game. And in most professions, and I'll jump to the kind of obvious ones that are professions in this sort of traditional sociological sense, you have to keep up to speed. So being a medical doctor, you have to go through every year a certain form of training to ensure you understand how to practice medicine safely, ethically. Now, one of the risks in our industry, as Stephen pointed out, particularly from a UK perspective, but I know it's not very different in other parts of Europe, we do not need a particular license to be a communicator. We can go without any education whatsoever. So therefore, we also don't necessarily accept it upon ourselves to think about what are our skills and what are our capabilities to do the job well. So I think it's something we have to get into the culture of our organizations, or the organizations we're responsible for, to think about how we ensure that we continue as individuals and as collectives of practitioners in an organization or a department have the qualification and the license to be able to give the advice that we have and that we give. You know, in our conversation, we brought up a number of areas that have transformed, and certainly Dejan and I will say have transformed since we first started looking at the landscape of public relations and strategic communication back in the early mid 2000s, just on technology alone, and how that the skills, the knowledge base we've touched on, and Dejan's mentioned it. So Stephen, the requirement for us to be much more cognizant of how to deal with and manage data sets, you know, and large data sets, and the usage and utilization of that. Similarly, you know, how we're going to in the future engage with and work alongside what is not going to go away, which is the process of bringing in artificial intelligence. So this is the landscape, and this is what's changing. Having a philosophy or an ethos of and a desire to be aware of where we have those limitations. I mean, I'll put my hand up quite readily, and did, you know, not so long ago, almost shy away from getting involved in ChatGPT, because as an academic, there's a bit of an anathema there for me around something that will create knowledge that isn't my knowledge. And I worry about that still a little as to how to utilize it, particularly as a scholar, because when and at which point is it my work, and when and at which point is it something that I have to declare is owned and produced by a third party? And for us in academia, it's clearly a major issue. Similarly, there's going to be there is and there are, as we already know, and many of you, if you're on the call who are students, you'll know the issues around plagiarism and potential how we utilize and use appropriately things like artificial intelligence in your work as a student. So I think what we've got to be aware is how to do those things. And I think there's a gap, basically. There's a space somewhere for us to be able to have tools, techniques and mechanisms for evaluating what we do. The first port of call is probably for you to sit and talk to, and if you are either in work or in education, is to talk around, as we would do, what do I need to know to do this particular role? What don't I know? How can I evaluate that? And you can work with colleagues, with mentors. The other thing in practice is I think it's really important that we have, we all work in networks through our kind of, you know, WhatsApps and our friendship groups, but our professional networks. Be aware of what other people are doing. Be cognizant of the changes that are happening, what skills and techniques are being used by others in their communication that you maybe aren't familiar with, and then think about how to ameliorate them. We need to probably as well obtain more sophisticated diagnostic tools of how we evaluate what we currently know and what we need to know. So it's something that I think firstly needs to be much more ingrained in the practitioner mindset. I think we also need to drive it through organizations. Maybe UPrera has a role, maybe other associations have a role in helping to sort of see what we should be looking for and doing that diagnostic. But I'm afraid there is an element of owning that yourself. You have to be probably aware and look at what's happening outside, but also look for training and development opportunities with organizations that in things that you're not familiar with. And if you don't know about it, ask a question as to why I don't, would be one answer. But Stephen, you may have a different view on that question from a practice point of view. I don't know.
No, no, it's it's fairly straightforward. You look around a boardroom table at the way other professions develop and measure themselves and the way they report, and you see shortcomings within public relations, and we need to address that gap.
There are still a couple of questions that Helena Kantanen asked about the AI and how we should be dealing with it. First of all, let me briefly give my response to that. I would say that AI is offering both threats and opportunities. And again, I would compare it to the emergence of electronic calculators and digital computers for accounting. When calculators and computers arrived, I guess that people in accounting were very nervous what it means for their jobs. Of course, they were fundamentally changed, as public relations is going to be fundamentally changed because of the emergence of AI. But I strongly believe, and I feel that AI is offering us great opportunities to get rid of the boring, what I would say, repetitive work that still exists also in public relations, and then be able to concentrate on more creative things. There is no way that AI is going to replace us where high touch has to be involved, where we need, but I was talking at the end about where we need authenticity, where we need personal engagement. It can help us develop stories, but still, the original stories are going to come from us. And absolutely, public relations practitioners should be the ones in organizations which are running this show. We should work hardly to be nativized, so to say. We all understand that our kids are much better at this because they were born into this. But we should be training ourselves very hard to be better than them. And I believe that we can be better than them, or at least as good as them. And we should be in our organizations able to show others what are the benefits for organizations, but also what are the threats and how can we contribute to safe usage and full exploitation of what is available to us. So these were the questions.
I think there's two responses to that. Generative AI is getting all the attention at the moment. Go and ask ChatGPT to write something, and it'll produce a pretty mediocre first draft of anything, and that's interesting. And it removes some work. I think the really interesting application that isn't being talked about so much is reductive AI, where you use AI or a large language model to make sense of a large data set. So, for example, a financial report, a prospectus, where you upload it, and I've done this with research papers. You ask it to extract arguments, methodologies, risks, limitations, and it provides like a second brain to you to help you. And I think that's really, really interesting from a public relations perspective. Second point, that notwithstanding, the issues that Ralph raised need to be figured out related to things like data management, privacy, copyright, training these models on data that belongs to a third party, who owns the IP. There's a whole series of societal issues need to be fixed up to address to manage the governance around this.
Yeah, I've now got the questions that I realized I was on a full screen, so I couldn't see your questions, but I've now seen them. So yes, we're probably answering many of these. Quick response that Helena was asking, just, and it's been answered, I know, a little, but yes, the slide sets are going to be available, and obviously so is the whole of the program, and yes, it can be shared. Yeah, I mean, I was just looking again back at the question we had on competencies. I think assessing them, I think it's there is a kind of certification element, and I think there is something about that. That's a space that is a bit contested and can be challenging. it doesn't all have to be assessed. I think often CPD is more about you identifying your needs, really, and then yourself creating a mode of learning. There's formal, learning programs like master's courses and degree courses at university, and I think we can do that, but badge it in a different way. CPD is really around identifying individualized learning needs, and I think that's something that is different. The other thing I think I could touch on, and I know that I've mentioned in the talk about the fact that we've got these kind of changing roles in organizations around these kind of advisory and consulting roles that come through. They also are things that may require some further development for individuals to be able to do those things better. I think that's an aspect. And the other one that we've often identified in the work that we've done in the past on communicators' skills and capabilities and how to contribute in the organization. We touched a bit on data and understanding data and those things, yes, but I think it is also understanding the core purpose of the organization, understanding what it's about, and that is around where is the organization's strategic direction. Doesn't matter whether it's a profit-based organization or a charitable-based organization or a non-government organization. What's the purpose? And I think understanding those strategic drivers and aligning them, as we've mentioned at the outset, around aligning strategy with communication is important. So I think there's still some areas for development for communicators to be much more in tune with this strategic contribution for the organization, but where communication, strategic communication will fit into that landscape as well. And I think that's an area that sometimes gets missed in development. So it isn't just about the technical and the tactical, it's also around the kind of critical thinking elements. Arguably, that would also link in with things that Stephen touched on and Dejan around changing methodologies, but then things around ethics, and do we understand our ethical purpose, our role within both the organization and society. Have we any more? Oh, so we've got another one. Christina, in multi-crisis world, is there a need for public engagement working with people in the field? This challenges the traditional communication function and competencies. Yes, I mean, I think we, well, I think this is the new reality that we are dealing with, really, and the complexities. Organizations, we are facing multi-crises, as it seems to me that we are in our societies as well at large. So we're a kind of, we are almost reflecting all of that, the organizational crises that are coming and the societal crises mold into one, and we're having to probably react and deal with them at the same time. And I mean, Stephen made comment on this because I think we saw, particularly, I noted it in the UK during COVID, that communications was elevated in importance in organizational settings, because here was an existential, Uber crisis that was affecting society, and organizations were forced to actually turn to their communicators in many ways to help them out of that. I don't know, Stephen, did you experience that? Have you got any thoughts that in this crisis, crisis situation?
There weren't any. There wasn't the skills within the management team to deal with, the complexity we faced during that situation. And it's been interesting. We've separate conversation. We've talked about this, where it's well known that there are a series of situations where public relations is actually brought to the fore. Media crisis, societal crisis, issues with leadership. Where the skills, if they don't exist within the management team, are sought externally during that moment. The challenge is it often reverts and resets. There was a question here. SK asked, where can I access some of these reductive AI services? I would urge you to have a look at the Anthropic tool, Claude 2.0, because that does a very, very good job of updating making sense of a large data set, just go and upload a research paper or management report and use the chatbot to interrogate it from different perspectives, and you'll be surprised by the result. Notwithstanding, as Ralph said, be careful about how you use that knowledge, because the question of, do you use that, is that your knowledge, or is that knowledge created by the bot, or surfaced by the bot?
I know that the panel have got other meeting commitments coming in 2 minutes time. We need to have closed. I'm really sorry about that, but we did say we'd go for an hour or so. We've gone approximately for an hour and 10 minutes as I see it, coming towards and the questions. I can't see any more at the moment. I open up that anyone can come back to us with any questions to myself, and I can liaise through with Dejan and Stephen if you have further questions that you'd like to ask us about the presentation today, or if anyone actually sees it later on and wants to come back with any observations. Again, we as a research team very welcome to hear those, and also to the feedback, to the comments that we've made. Anything you agree with, disagree with, always welcome to hear those viewpoints. But for me, I think that's us finishing up. I'd like to say a very big thank you, obviously, to my two colleagues and Stephen for joining us and coming in and making your observations, which I do always value, brings to life what essentially is something that Dejan and I have lived and breathed for a very long time and got grayer and grayer over time. And so thank you again, Stephen. Thank you, Dejan. And I don't know if I hand back to Anchor or do we just close off? Maybe I can just check. Not getting any feedback at the moment, I don't think.
Yes.
Maria's going to close. Okay, thank you, everybody. Well, again, I repeat, all materials are available on the website, www.communication.monitor.eu. And similarly, our contact details are there if anyone has any questions. It's been great to talk to everybody. Hope you found it interesting, and good luck with following the rest of the UPrera series, an important series to support and to back. But thank you.
Bye.